So I want to pick up on this theme we've been hearing all morning about the bringing in art, bringing in artists. Design has been a huge part of the initiative. And, as we think about inclusive placemaking and equity, I think sometimes we forget what I believe to be a core truth, which is that beauty is a basic right. And access to beauty, access to good design is not for those people over there, it's for everybody. Can you talk about how you have prioritized design, access to beauty in the process? And you started to hint at it a bit. How have you actually used that as an engagement strategy?
Yeah, I can start, and then Alexa can talk in more detail about the city approach to this work. So I will say that one of the things that we hear a lot in our work is of a fear, sometimes from residents, that investment and beautiful public spaces will lead to displacement and will mean that they can't stay in their neighborhood. So there's sort of a hesitancy about investment like this. And similar to you, we believe that all neighborhoods and healthy neighborhoods deserve well-designed spaces and beautiful public places. And what needs to come with that are mechanisms to make sure that doesn't lead to displacement or gentrification. So that does include policy, and it does include land acquisition mechanisms, but it also includes community participation and ownership in the process. And one of the things that we focus on at Detroit Collaborative Design Center is community engaged design processes. So designing the engagement process as much as the thing itself to make sure that residents are a part of the process, participate in decision making, and really feel a sense of ownership throughout the process and over the final product. But through that, perhaps more importantly, better design solutions are created that are more responsive to the needs and interests and passions of existing residents. So that's really at the core of how we frame our work and contributes to this conversation of how beautiful design is for everybody in every neighborhood.
Yeah, I think those are great points. I think where I sit, I see the problem more as there's too much scarcity of beauty and good design, that it's become a luxury good, but we actually need more than less, right? It's like, don't not do beautiful design because people will like it. It's like we need to make that the bar for our public realm in general. So I think, in the planning department in Detroit, our charge has really been to try and improve design excellence citywide in architecture and public spaces and buildings. Sometimes our development community freaks out a little bit, but then I think they actually come around to see that the value added to their own work, that it's really about how do you frame that conversation to be more about everyone. I think specifically to this neighborhood, I talked a little bit about the park. I think, the name of the park actually came from comments from the community, right? So this was a brand new, from scratch city park where none existed. It wasn't an improvement. So I think some people were like, great, that's the investment we wanted. And others were maybe more like, oh, is this for us? Like, who is this for? We haven't had investment. It must not be for us. So, the park's name actually came from the former community school. Our school system in Detroit has gone through quite a lot of turmoil and change over the decades. And the school that had been the community school sort of got renamed and was run by a different entity. That the park actually was named after this school, really as a way for the community to keep that name as being something that was a central heart of what made identity in this neighborhood. So really, someone was like, well, it was our park, can we name it? And I was like, yeah, like, it's such a basic piece, but that I think started to change how we thought about the process. We engaged a Detroit-based artist, but who works internationally, named Hubert Massey. He does very large-scale mosaics, murals, and he had this really great process where he works in ceramic tile, and it was sort of like a ceramic tile by number installation, where we just thought there was something really great, not only to, I think, the imaginative process of working with the community to say, how do we take the story of who you are and turn it into something visible and public through art, but also how do we get you physically involved hands-on in this process where you could then say, like, I literally built this piece of the park. I think it changes the relationship between people in that park. They have a specific history to it. I think it changes the conversation about stewardship. But for us, I think it provided both a process way to talk about how people felt about change and then a really physical tangible, like, stewardship component of playing a hand in building this thing that was coming to the community.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to talk now about partnerships and coalition building. You are just two members of what is a very large team that has evolved over time. And I think it's also worth noting, Alexa, that the work for the city started just as the city was emerging from bankruptcy. Not as if this was starting in sort of a fully functioning city government, a fully functioning planning team. The planning department was actually being built at the same time that this work was being built. So again, as I said with the earlier case study, we talk about case studies when the thing is there and the coalition is built. Can you talk about what it was like, lessons learned from actually building the coalition and how you've sustained it over time?
Yeah, and I think what's interesting, so we started this work probably 2015 explicitly in this community. I think even both Sierra and I have been through all of this work. Both also have different jobs even than when we started. So I think, yeah, we've been working in a very dynamically changing environment when it comes to partners and institutions. Yeah, I started in the planning department right as we were still restructuring, actually, from the bankruptcy. We rehired, or we sort of like changed all the planning positions, got them new job titles, got new salary bands. Like, everyone had to reapply for their jobs into a new planning department, all while we were trying to launch this work, right? So, I mean, that's the downside. The upside, I think, is it really gave us, there's always a silver lining. It gave us the opportunity, I think, to say, you know, the work we were trying to do and figure out on the ground really shaped the ethos of what the planning department became. So the work we're doing in the Fitzgerald community has really become the model for now how the city and some of the same partners, Invest Detroit being one of our CDFI, Community Development Financial Institution partners, are now working to channel investment in 10 other areas across the city. So this idea that it's not only development and multifamily, but actually parks and streets and all these other parts of what makes up a neighborhood is now how the city has come to do business broadly. So I think it gave us an opportunity to shape that as we were actually learning on the ground. So maybe a upside of like build the plane while you fly it, your plane gets better at whatever direction you're going in. And then I think, you know, maybe in part because of the crisis, I think there was a recognition in the city that we had to do business differently. So from the get-go, like Sierra's been at the table, the Live 6 Alliance has been at the table. A lot of these partners, like we kind of all got together and we're like, how do we do this? There is some momentum starting to happen around downtown. There's a lot bigger business entities at play. You know, how do we actually start to bring investment to these neighborhoods where, you know, there isn't a huge job driver, right? There's not a big corporation who's like, I'm going to relocate 5,000 staff to this neighborhood. We had to get a lot more crafty, I think, about what we did. And I think for me from the city, that meant finding a lot of partners who are really good at things that the city wasn't. So, you know, the city is not really good at hiring a local resident to do something because I'd probably have to procure it and like get a PO and take that to city council somehow. Can I find a nonprofit set of partners who can actually do these things and have some of the relationships and the structures on the ground? So I think it's been actually a huge value add to the city. And Sierra, I can let you talk about from where you sit what that looks like.
Yeah, I will say, as more of an observer, the collaboration between city departments and CDFIs in this neighborhood work is instrumental to this holistic approach to neighborhood investment. And then I think sounds so simple, but I think what has really made this work, the Civic Commons work in Fitzgerald, sing is regular meetings between all of our different partners physically in the neighborhood, which sounds silly, but is hard to do. We're all really busy people, but getting together, and even if we aren't actively working on one initiative together, comparing notes and collaborating and seeing how things align is really essential. And actually, as we're planning sort of towards the next chapter of Civic Commons, that sense of coalition and coming together of the different players that make projects hum is really central to how Alexa's thinking about shaping that up. We were talking about it on the walk over here this morning, and also expanding who's at the table. So we've been working on that team that Alexa put up at the beginning, and that's sort of our regular biweekly meeting. But now there's more happening in the neighborhood, and we're developing a working group that represents everybody who's working on initiatives in the area to make sure that all efforts are coordinated and well informed across the board. I also wanted to just mention that alongside all of this work, this neighborhood is also bookended by two important educational institutions, which is part of this collaborative network as well. So on the east is the University of Detroit Mercy. My organization's a program of that, and is sort of representative of how the university is reaching out off campus, as is Lift 6 Alliance, which originated from the university. But then on the west side, there was formerly Marygrove College, which very sadly closed, but has a new life in the form of a P20 or Cradle to Career campus that is being developed with a lot of intention. And those are examples of other players who are in the mix and will continue to be major partners in this collaboration and those meetings, those monthly meetings or quarterly meetings that are instrumental.
Great. So I'm going to switch gears again and talk about something also complex, which is money, right? And handing it back to Alexa. So there's obviously the philanthropic dollars that are flowing that help catalyze with Civic Commons, but certainly did not cover everything. And so I wonder if you can just talk about the range of funds, dollars that are flowing, how that's managed in such a multidisciplinary, multi-organizational team, and also how you have engaged in resident power by actually doing some mini grants to residents for some of this work.
Yeah, it's a great question. Now I'm like, ooh, I wish I had my money slide. I actually have this slide. It looks a little bit like a New York subway system map of like how the money is actually moving in different colors through all these partners. Because yes, I think so. When we started this work, we knew at the city, we have pretty limited dollars. We are mostly spending funds we're getting from HUD around affordable housing. We had a bond against gas tax revenue that we are using for streetscape improvements, and that's kind of the bulk of the public dollars that we have at our disposal, all of which have like tons of regulations and loopholes because they come from the federal government or other sources that you can't be as creative as maybe you want to be. I think what was really amazing about the opportunity with the philanthropic dollars we got when we did was it really allowed us to fill in the gaps around that. So I could say, we have $1.6 million that we're going to invest in home dollars into making sure that there's affordable housing in this neighborhood. I have, $5 million of streetscape funds that's coming from a road bond. We can use that to leverage like $4 million of net new private philanthropic or corporate philanthropic money that can pay for things like the park we didn't have budgeted, that's flexible to fund some of the resident programming we did, some of the pop-ups we did, some of the workforce pieces that we did. Where again, it's probably the outcomes driven focus where if we said, okay, we want to deliver programming, we want to deliver some physical change in terms of a new park, we want to empower some of these leaders, ambassadors, like let's give them actual mini grants to say like, go try it out. Like you can come to me and say like, I want this and this and this and this and this. And I'm like, well, I only have money for one. If I'm actually putting the dollars into your hands, like you're going through this and saying like, oh, I wanted to do t-shirts and ice cream and face painting and a bounce house and this, but now we're having a conversation that's really different about how do we allocate scarce resources in the neighborhood most effectively. It really changes how that takes place. So having the philanthropy dollars where they can be a little riskier, it's not taxpayer money, it's not enough to fund everything, but it's enough, I think, to fill in key gaps that we needed to meet those outcomes. So Sierra talked about these biweekly meetings we have where, we're talking about the stuff and the projects, but we're also trying to align all these different investments. So how does investment in a park align with investment in housing, align with commercial corridor redevelopment, align with the infrastructure improvements? Where are those projects? If one's delayed, what happens to the other ones? What are the funding timelines? There's a whole logistics to the resources behind this that is also an active part of that conversation. But it has also been a mix of, using some opportunistic private philanthropy dollars with trying to spend public dollars a lot more strategically, thinking about leverage and thinking about the neighborhood as a holistic unit as opposed to like street tree dollars and curb dollars and sidewalk dollars as independent capital projects.
Just from the community side of things, Alexa already mentioned the ability to hire resident leaders for these ambassador positions within the neighborhood has been really important to this work. And it is true that nonprofit partners have had more flexibility. I will say that sometimes it's run through the university, which is like mildly more flexible than the city. But we've definitely built systems by which residents can be compensated by their participation, which whenever possible should be the case. So I just wanted to say that out loud.
One other opportunity, I think, where we tried, so we knew we wanted to do that from the get-go as an outcome. There is a metrics component to this initiative that we won't have time to get into. It's all on the internet. But we decided, because of our desire to build trust and engagement, we were like, well, if we're going to go out and do door-to-door surveying, like, we should totally train and pay residents to do that. So from the get-go, that just became something that worked in the process. We're like, great, there was funding for metrics anyway. We just deployed it in a way to better achieve those outcomes. So all the data that we've collected from this work is actually done by paid resident field data researchers. So they do observation studies, they do door-to-doors, and that's been huge, I think, not only in the engagement and trust building, but it's also built unintentional champions. Like, we had a whole bike lane gentrification, we have an ongoing bike lanes and gentrification conversation in the city, where, you know, one of our residents, actually Stephanie, who was up here, was probably like, could have gone either way on bike lanes. Like, oh, okay, I don't know why you guys are so into these. Not my thing. Rather have more parking. She was out doing counts on the corridor and realized, you know, at every hour of the day, I counted someone on a bike. Like, I'm in my car. I don't see these people. I don't think about people on bikes. And her actually going out and doing that data collection, I think, changed her perspective to the point that she's now an advocate for this as a resource in her community. So again, a really unintended but beautiful consequence of that work.
Terrific. So I'm going to pose one more question, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. And I want to go back, Sarah, to something that you said about the pop-ups, because I think pop-ups are terrific, and prototyping is terrific. But I think what made them work in this situation is that they were always tied to the longer-term investment. I think in many communities, when folks are prototyping or doing pop-ups, it's just that. It is a prototype or a pop-up, and it never connects to the larger investment. And, you know, we have this language, cities as laboratories. They're not laboratories. Human beings live there, right? So we can't, like, they're not our plaything as urbanists. And so I wonder if you could just sort of expound on this idea of how you made explicit that this testing, this prototyping was in fact connected to larger investment, and sort of any advice for other communities that are thinking about using that approach.
Sure. So I'll talk about two different types of pop-ups, and Alexa can jump in too. So the first one that I already mentioned was testing out programming as a means to activate vacant spaces that then became the park. So we were actually doing these activity days every month in the summer in vacant lots that would in the future be the park. So that built relationships with program partners who are rooted in the neighborhood, like a yoga instructor who grew up at her grandma's house on San Juan, or arts workshop leader who grew up across McNichols. So really identifying and building partnerships with those folks. But I think what has been, I'm trying to answer your question directly. So I think what has worked about that is the continuity. So it wasn't a one-time thing. It was every month in the summer, and we're going into our fourth or fifth summer. I think maybe our fifth summer, actually, because I've been doing it for a lot of summers.
It's 2020 now.
Yeah. So that continuity and building in more infrastructure within resident leaders to be leading it in partnership with the city and partnership with DCDC. So it's not just a pop-up, but it has led to something. And every year it's become more real and more towards its sort of final finished state. The other type of pop-up we did, which I'm sure many people are familiar with, was in partnership at first with Better Block, which is a Texas-based organization, and we it was a big lift, but we did 3 different pop-ups where we did temporary installations of streetscape improvements along Livernois and then along McNichols, coupled with a ton of programming, sometimes, thankfully, coupling with existing programming like Jazz on the Ave, which draws a lot of people, but also creating new programs along McNichols to bring people into the conversation. And that was another example of just sort of being a spectacle to invite people into the conversation. But that pop-up was engagement. It was a way to have a conversation about streetscapes, about bike lanes, that wouldn't happen in the normal meeting setting. We also had meetings. We also had other types of engagement, but those pop-ups really brought it to life in a very real way that is sometimes hard to imagine if you're not steeped in this every day the way that we are. And it wasn't all like, oh, we saw it and now we love it. It sparked a conversation and a debate that's ongoing, as Alexa alluded to, but enabled people to really sort of dive into the issue and see what it could be like. And again, it's not a one-time thing because now it's being built. And the Livernois streetscape is at completion, so people can see it in reality as well.
Thank you. So we're going to open it up for questions. We have just a few minutes before lunch. We'll have a longer Q&A later, so this is not your only opportunity. And I don't know if Jo is back in the room, but she's welcome to join us, and we've got a question right down front. If you can just tell us who you are, that'd be great.
Thanks. My name's Colby Daly. I'm the Managing Director of Build Healthy Places Network. And I would just love to hear maybe if each of you could just say one thing that is most critical advice to an organization that's looking to do similar work across silos and communities, and especially in the sort of middle of the country, smaller mid-sized cities.
I'll start because I'm holding the mic. And this is really what DCDC's work is all about. But I think the most critical thing is making sure that residents and community members have a meaningful decision-making role in the design and planning process, and not just cursory or sort of to check the box, but really designing engagement so that it can impact the outcomes and can really reflect the community.
I think having the really clear mission around the outcomes you're trying to achieve, in that there are lots of dollars being spent and invested every day, just sort of in a business as usual way. If you are able to spark the imagination and interest of those people to spend them in a different way, sometimes you get an extra grant and that's wonderful, but I think it's, to me, more about like, how do we change how we do everyday stuff to get the outcomes that we want? And I think having that focus up front can be really helpful.
So I'm going to add from the perspective of another one of our Civic Commons communities, which is Akron, because you asked about small and mid-sized cities. And our great friend and champion in Akron, Dan Rice, always says we have to move at the speed of trust. So I think, anytime we're engaged in this work, especially when there's maybe grant dollars and a grant timeline associated with it, neighborhood transformation doesn't happen in a 3-year period or a 5-year period. Maybe it doesn't even happen in a 10-year period. And you can really only go as fast as the trust that you're building with residents and with other partners. And I think it can be really easy to lose sight of that because we got to get this grant report in, we've got to, get this thing filed with HUD. Those are all important deadlines, but the most important metric is whether or not residents are on board with what you're doing and they're actually, co-creating and co-designing and ultimately co-stewarding the work.
I would also add to that, it's easier to build on something where something exists. So I would do some sort of scan and understanding of who and what is in the community, what are they working on currently, what is the system of funding that already exists so that there's something to leverage. Because I think that it's a much more difficult row to hoe when people have to create something from whole cloth as opposed to having some opportunities for support that would give them lift and build momentum.
We have time for one more question before lunch. Yes.
So I don't have a question, but I have a comment and really a shout out. I had the privilege of visiting the Fitzgerald neighborhood about a year ago, and I think it personifies inclusive, healthy places. This morning, when Laura took us through the exercise on healthy places, we most of us gave examples of parks, right? That's what comes to mind to us. And parks are great places, great outdoor spaces that really help us think about parks. But inclusive, healthy places, it's what takes us really from place making, looking at just one spot on a map, one geographically defined space, to to really the space that connects the parks to the streets, to the spaces between buildings. And I think that's what you've really captured in the Fitzgerald neighborhood, thinking about the corridors and the businesses and having it designed by the people and having that design really elevate dignity in the neighborhood. So I just wanted to give a shout out and a thank you, because that's the difference between placemaking and inclusive, healthy places. Thank you.